Now, I'm pleased to introduce RPAG's Managing Director with the ERISA team, John Nelson, as well as RPAG's Vice President of Business Development, Jesse Taylor, to present the most common fiduciary errors and how to avoid them. Jesse?
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you all for being here today. We do a lot of different content and webinars at RPAG, and after just finishing up the Spring Summit roadshows in a few different cities around the country, John and I thought it would be a great idea to share some of those great concepts and ERISA updates and litigation updates that are most important to advisors, and do it in a webinar format in case you missed those events, but also share some of those ideas on how as an advisor and how utilizing RPAG, you can help fix some of those common mistakes or maybe some of the most pressing issues out there for advisors today. So we thought of no better person to bring along than John Nelson, and John Nelson is our Managing Director for ERISA Compliance. And if you have any questions for John throughout this webinar, please don't hesitate to use the chat or Q&A feature, and we'll make sure we get to those at the end of the webinar today. So John, take it away.
What I would start with today is maybe take a look at what we call the share class litigation. This, of course, is ERISA litigation involving whether or not the plan is using the least expensive share class. Let's start with what the ERISA actually requires. So we start with Section 404A1A of ERISA, and that says that fiduciaries must discharge their plan-related duties for the exclusive purpose of providing benefits. And I've underlined the key language, defraying reasonable expenses of administering the plan. So that's where this concept of monitoring fee expenses comes into play. The first case I want to mention here is a very recent one, Kong versus Trader Joe's Company. This is out of the Ninth Circuit, decided in April of this year. And the plaintiffs alleged there was a failure to monitor and control the offering of a number of mutual funds. Now, in this case, the plan was offering retail share classes that carried higher fees than those charged by the identical institutional share class by the same investment. Except for the extra fees, the share classes were identical. Now, I think it's key to note here the court's reasoning. This is a key concept to keep in mind. Wasting beneficiaries' money is imprudent. Okay, that should kind of go without saying, but the court wanted to emphasize that. And that's where this concept comes into. Another case dealing with this is Davis versus Salesforce, Inc. This is also decided earlier this year. In that case, the plaintiffs identified two lower cost JP Morgan share classes, R5 and R6, that they allege were available as substitutes for 9 JP Morgan target date smart retirement funds offered by the plan. As to those 9 target date funds, plaintiffs allege that the more expensive share classes chosen by defendants were the same in every respect other than price as their less expensive counterparts. And also this case is key because it's one of the cases where the plaintiffs are actually starting to now talk about the CITs. So also here, the plaintiffs allege defendants imprudently failed to investigate and timely switched to available CITs, which had the same underlying investments and asset allocations to their mutual fund counterparts, but of course had lower net expense ratio. So we're seeing two principles in these two cases. One is the concept of retail versus institutional. The second concept is the idea of mutual fund versus CIT. So once again, when you're advising your clients with respect to investment lineups, you need to be using the least expensive share class. If you're not, you need to have a good reason why you're not doing that. So the legal principle we take from ERISA is that a trustee cannot ignore the power the trust wields to obtain favorable investment products, particularly when those products are substantially identical, other than their lower cost, to products the trustees already selected. So once again, trustees have a duty to use lowest cost funds. Now, how do you determine whether fees are reasonable or not? Remember, that's the standard. The standard under ERISA isn't that you use the cheapest, it's that you have a reasonable process to determine that fees are reasonable. The best way to do that, of course, is benchmarking plan services and costs. The responsibility for defraying reasonable expenses of administrating a plan is clear, but the definition of reasonable is not. ERISA does not define the word. Government agencies only provide general guidance for evaluating 401k fees. So the DOL suggests, and here's the language from the DOL, Establish an objective process to aid in your decision-making process. Now, this idea of benchmarking came up in the Tussey versus ABB case decided several years ago. In that case, the court said plan fiduciaries need to compare one provider's services against others and to do so using market-based data. Specifically, the court noted to assess the prudence of a revenue-sharing arrangement, ABB had to determine the market rate for record-keeping services provided to the plan. So in other words, you have to determine whether fees are reasonable, determine what the baseline market rate is. Without such a baseline, the court said it's impossible to determine whether a particular arrangement adds value to the plan. In this case, the court specifically criticized ABB, the employer, because it did not obtain a benchmark cost of Fidelity services in this case. Now, I think that just makes common sense to think about it. How do you establish whether fees are reasonable? The best way to do that is to actually take the plan out and benchmark it against other service providers. ERISA requires that plan fiduciaries engage in a prudent process to select and monitor services prior to the plan. This requires a comparison of value and cost. For assessing service providers, the DOL and courts have said plan fiduciaries should obtain market data, evaluate plan services within that context. The most cost-effective approach to gathering comparative market data is through the use of benchmarking services that comply with the ERISA requirements. So to summarize this concept, with share class litigation, you need to establish initially a baseline for what the costs for the plan are. You do that through benchmarking. Then you can look at share classes to decide how those fees get paid. It's okay to do revenue sharing, but you can't use revenue sharing if the net result is resulting to the plan paying excess fees. So establish that bench line and then figure out how you're going to pay the costs. That make sense? Jesse, you have some thoughts on that?
Well, yeah. So, John, great information. I think it's a great overview. What oftentimes I hear from advisors is, most advisors out there who are not RPAG members are doing that really on an ad hoc basis. They're not having a real formal process in terms of taking their plans out every 3 to 5 years because it's time prohibitive. It takes a lot of time to do that analysis and capture those bids and proposals and put it in a structured way. So with RPAG, what we do, nothing is necessarily revolutionary in terms of the services that you all provide, but what we do is we make it scalable and efficient. So you can provide a variety of different benchmarking and RFP services to your clients on an ongoing basis, on a consistent basis across your entire book, from, as John said, from a documentation perspective, but even utilizing the technology and the integration of the investment scoring system and the fee benchmarking of proposals to capture that revenue sharing information. So there's a few different resources there. Before I even talk about the benchmarking suite resources from the investment scorecard, to reference John's share class cases, we do have share class mapping reports, and you can compare share classes through an asset class review. So from the investment analysis perspective, there's a lot of resources there that you can leverage to make sure that you're in a proper share class for that fund. When it comes to the negotiation, traditionally, as most of you know who are longtime RPAG advisors, we recommend using the RPAG provider analysis, which is over on the right side of the screen. That's kind of the Cadillac service in terms of the most robust fee benchmarking, provider benchmarking and analysis report. Up to about 500 data points, you can compare from a live market bid perspective, current provider, alternative providers, as well as go out to the incumbent and rebid. That's going to be the most intense process, takes the most time, and is going to have the most documentation. But we also think in between those studies that you should go out and benchmark your plans every year, one from a defensive perspective and also from a documentation perspective. You want to show their clients, so you can use the plan fees PRISM report, and that's going to be really quick. Take 2 minutes to create and say, how does your plan compare to the average, the low and the high in the marketplace from their investment record keeping and advisory fees. Now, as David mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we'll be rolling out a new tool called RFP Express as part of the plan fees portal that kind of combines the best of both worlds. The ease of use and quick, instantaneous user interface of plan fees, along with that side-by-side, apples-to-apples comparison of the provider analysis. That's called RFP Express. That's coming soon. There's a sneak peek of it, I think, at tomorrow's webinar with Luke Vandermillen. And we're really excited about that, working with all the record keepers out there to really streamline that process for proposals. It's not going to go as in-depth and precise as the provider analysis report, but it's going to be that first screen for a market analysis. And then you can always go deeper with the provider analysis. So in terms of the benchmarking suite that we have, very robust. It's going to give you every aspect from the annual fee benchmarking, the periodic fee benchmarking, the proposals for new business to get a quick market analysis. And so we're trying to create a very holistic approach to provider selection here so you can fulfill your duties, but also help you from a new business perspective.
ERISA is all about process and documentation. And that's what we've tried to do with RPAG, is put together the process for you, as well as the documentation to demonstrate that the client, the plan fiduciary, does have a process in place for monitoring plan expenses. Thanks, Jesse. Let's talk a little about ESG. ESG is getting a lot of publicity right now, not only in the retirement plan space, but in the investment space in general. ESG is something that's been going back and forth with the Department of Labor, depending on the particular administration for the last few years. So as some of you may recall, under the Trump administration, the DOL issued a proposed regulation basically saying that plan fiduciaries could not take into account ESG factors in weighing investment options for plans. The Biden administration came in, said they're not going to enforce that proposed regulation. They issued a new proposed regulation called Prudence and Loyalty in Selecting Plan Investments and Exercising Shareholder Rights. Now, in this announcement, the DOL is now saying that ESG factors may be a permissible consideration. The proposed rule adds language to expressly state that when evaluating risk and return, a fiduciary's duty of prudence requires an evaluation of the economic effects of climate change, environmental, social, governance factors in determining whether the particular investment is prudent. So what the DOL is saying now is that ESG factors are an appropriate risk and return consideration. So the purpose of this change is to make clear ESG factors are appropriate factors that fiduciaries should consider. But the proposal makes it clear, the concept is still that you cannot subordinate the financial interests of participants to promote an ancillary objective. I think the best way to think about this is that if you're selecting among two different funds, let's say you're looking at large cap growth funds, one large cap growth fund scores a 10 on the scorecard system based on risk and return objectives. One scores a 7, which is acceptable, but not as high as a 10. But the fund scoring 7 has higher ESG ratings. Can you select that fund scoring a 7 based on the ESG factors? I would say no, because I would think in that situation, you're subjugating the financial interests of participants to promote the ESG factors. But if you have two funds scoring a 10, you can certainly use the ESG factors to make the selection there. Another change from the old rule to the current proposed regulation is that you are now allowed to use as a QDIA funds that do take into account ESG factors. Under the Trump administration rule, that was a strict no-no. You couldn't use ESG factors in selecting a QDIA, but now you can. So QDIAs can also have ESG factors in their investment strategy. And then we have the tiebreaker rule. The tiebreaker rule under the old regulation said that the two investments had to be, for the most part, indistinguishable. Now the new rule is a little more flexible. It says that they just need to be equally appropriate for the plan. Back to my example of the two 10s, then using ESG factors to choose the fund that has the ESG considerations. Jesse, what are some of the things we're doing to help our advisors with ESG considerations?
Yeah, so given every the regulations and the proposals that John just brought up, what we've done at RPAG is we've partnered with MSCI to start capturing their ESG ratings and have those synced in and integrated with the RPAG system. So just how you can drag in when you're creating an investment review for a client, and you can show a module on peer group analysis or a module on style box, you can now show a module on ESG ratings. So it'll take those investments that you have within the plan, and it'll show quality ratings, a final rating, and a letter rating, how it corresponds. And this is based off MSCI. It's very seamless within the tool. So show the next slide here. And how that's going to work is MSCI has both an environmental, a social, and governance rating, and then that aggregates and creates an average for a final rating. And then that final rating in a numerical perspective is associated with a letter score. So those are going to be color coded, and it's going to also weigh it. So if you prefer to or like to, like John just brought up, like the tiebreaker perspective, you can look at two investments and say, hey, they're very similar in their score and their quantitative and qualitative metrics. Let's take a look at their ESG and how they compare. And you can work with your client if that's something that they would like to see. And I know there's some clients who would really love to have this. And so this is going to be baked into the RPAG scorecard system, and something that you can just hit a button, keep it in your template, and show this to all of your clients or some of your clients, however you prefer. We're going to have more information, a full webinar later on this summer when this goes out. I know at our national conference in September, we'll be talking a lot about this rating system, but we're excited, and it's in the process works. This is obviously a sneak peek preview at how it's going to work, but it's something that our investment team led by Jeff Elvander and Jeff Keeling are working very hard to have this integrated.
Yeah, that's a great example, Jesse. I appreciate that, because you can see how you could use the ESG factors here in the tiebreaker context, choosing among funds that have similar investment-related scores. Okay, thanks, Jesse. Let's continue now with another, I think, hot topic, and this is this whole idea of advisors who have a significant piece of their business being IRA rollover business. So remember now, the DOL has taken the position that an IRA rollover recommendation is considered investment advice subject to ERISA fiduciary duties. So we have a new prohibited transaction exemption. In this PTE, you have to comply with the prohibited transaction exemption in order to get paid on the IRA rollover. That's why this is so important. If you're not complying, then you can't get paid. Being paid would be a prohibited transaction. So that's why you have to comply with this new prohibited transaction exemption. What the prohibited transaction exemption requires is that the investment advice fiduciary, that would be you, must first provide advice in accordance with the impartial conduct standards. You have to acknowledge your fiduciary status in writing, and the DOL did provide a model fiduciary acknowledgement for part of that. You have to describe in writing the services you're going to provide. You have to describe in writing material conflicts of interest, for example, how you make money if your recommendation is accepted. And I think most importantly here, and where I think a lot of our advisors need help, is documenting the reasons that a rollover recommendation is in the best interest of the investor, and provide that documentation to the investor. Now, to put some context around that rollover recommendation, whether it's in your client's best interest, these are some typical factors that you might consider. Now, like for example, can your client leave his or her money in the plan? Now, generally the answer is yes. A participant whose vested account balance exceeds $5,000 can postpone distribution until the later of normal retirement age under the plan, or age 62, because in order for the plan to distribute that vested account balance greater than $5,000, the participant has to consent. So the question is, can you leave money in the plan? Generally, the answer is yes. You want to be able to compare the range of investment alternatives available under the plan and the IRA. So this is important because you see, you're going to have to get information about the plan. Now, some of that information might be available on the participant fee disclosure, but the participant may or may not have that. So we'll talk to you a little bit about how we help you get that information. You need to be able to compare fees and expenses under the plan and the IRA. Here you need to ask, does the employer pay all or some of the plan fees and expenses? If the IRA fees and expenses are more, then what added benefits justify those higher costs? Take a look at the forms of distribution under the plan and the IRA. For example, many plans limit the form of distribution to lump sum only, while the IRA would, of course, allow for periodic installments, partial withdrawals, more flexibility. Consider the ability to tailor withdrawals to your client's particular income needs. Also, take a look at the different rules that apply for penalty-free withdrawals. If your client terminates, for example, after age 55, payments from the plan are not subject to the early 59.5 penalty. That age 55 exemption, though, is not available for IRAs. That's just an example. On the other hand, IRA distributions for first-time home buyers, qualified education expenses, those are exempt. Another factor to consider are Roth conversions. Does the plan allow for the conversion of non-Roth funds through an internal Roth conversion? Think about the application of the MRD rules, IRA versus plan. Consider the difference in protection from creditors and legal judgments, IRA versus plan. And I just mentioned as a last point, whether the plan holds company stock, employer securities. If the employer is privately held, those securities might stay in the plan. Most IRA custodians probably wouldn't accept an asset like that. So these are some of the things to consider in determining whether or not the rollover is in your client's best interest. Jesse, some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so given the requirements set out very clearly in PTE 2020, we've been developing the Rollover Analyzer within RPAG. This tool is going to be available to all members this summer. Very, very easy to use tool. Just take a few minutes to run through. Similar interface to the Target Date Analyzer, Stable Value Analyzer, any of the other tools that you have access to. Integrates. One of the advantages, and you might have access to a rollover tool, or your broker dealer RIA might be subscribing to another tool out there. This is going to be all very similar to that. What's nice is that this integrates with the RPAG client data. John brought up, the participant might not know their investments, might not know the fees of a current plan. Well, if you have that information within RPAG, most of you do for all of your clients, that information syncs up. So you're going to be able to compare and say, we know the all-in costs and fees and expenses of this retirement plan. We know the services and investment capabilities of that retirement plan and how it's going to compare to the rollover, the IRA that is being recommended or potentially recommended. And then if there's no data, we're integrating, we're adding some cool features like integrating with Larkspur for 5,500 information on understanding if the plan that they're with, or let's say you're working with an individual that you have an individual outside of a retirement plan where you have an individual relationship with, you can capture their information from the 5,500. Know if this is a $2 million plan, and then integrating with plan fees, you can the rules and regs actually allow for leveraging a nationally a benchmark level for a plan of that size. So if the plan is $1.5 million that this individual is part of, our plan fees data and tool can say that the average fee all-in expense for a plan of $1.5 million is, let's say, as an example, 150 basis points. And then you're able to compare that to the cost of the IRA or a recommended solution that you're providing. And then there's a whole suitability and know your customer. So you're going to put in the information on the client, on the individual. You're going to see what their biggest concerns are, how important are certain aspects like fees and expenses, investments, tax considerations, R&Ds, and then other service considerations. So you're able to weight that, and then it's going to give an overall recommendation whether to roll over or stay within the plan. And then ultimately, too, the rules require that a firm have oversight. And so we're adding a dashboard where users within your account can see, all right, which advisors provided which recommendations for rollovers and how did those go and across which clients. So very, very easy dashboard, similar to our advisor reports or advisor IQ that you might be familiar with already. So we're really excited about this tool too. It's in the process right now, along with some of those other ones that I just mentioned. And this you'll be hearing more information about this summer.
Yeah, Jesse, thanks. This is great stuff. I just want to emphasize again, bullet points 3 and 4 there. Remember, the concept is that as the advisor, you need to compare the plan to the proposed IRA. The best source of data for the plan is going to be that participant 404A5 fee disclosure. But if you can't get that, the prohibited transaction exemption allows you to use market-based data. So what we've done is put together the market-based data when that fee disclosure isn't available. Great tools. Thanks, Jesse. The other thing I wanted to mention here is this idea of fiduciary training. What we're seeing now, when the DOL goes out to audit a plan, the DOL is asking for documentation that members of the plan fiduciary committee are receiving fiduciary training. Now, many plan sponsors have adopted a best practice of inviting an ERISA attorney in to provide an overview of fiduciary responsibilities to the plan committee. But oftentimes employers have a difficult time finding the budget or the time to schedule that meeting. What the DOL wants to see is independent fiduciary training. And of course, with the RPAG program, we've put together 20 education modules that you can take out and meet with your clients and review those modules to provide that education training. Jesse, sorry, before I go back, did you want to talk just a moment on that?
Sure. We often get asked about, how can we help advisors in this space? So the Fiduciary Fitness Program has been around for for many years and has gone through quite a bit of updates over that time. And probably every 4 to 5 years or so, we update the modules and push out new pieces. What you have access to, as John said, those 20 education pieces, but that also goes along with a few dozen documentation pieces and templates for committee charters and other fiduciary governance items. And beyond just the training, if you're not comfortable delivering yourself, all of those modules are recorded by our ERISA team, and you can present those videos and send them to your client before each meeting that you have, and then easily add those modules into even something like an investment review. So that investment review is more than just investments. You can have the fiduciary governance training within that as well. And John and team also put together a litigation brief. That's a module within the investment review that you can add. If, let's say, you've done a great job with the investments, not much to talk about this quarter, you can add that brief in and spend 5 to 10 minutes on talking about, I think this quarter is Secure Act 2.0 and what's happening there. And then John and the ERISA team put together a quarterly hot topics newsletter. That's something that you can take, brand as your own, and send out to your clients. So, and as well as webinars like these, we do have the client hosted webinars that are part of the marketing content program that you can invite your clients and prospects to. So there's a whole host of resources for fiduciary governance and education that are available. And we're continuing to push those out. And John and I have a lot of ideas for the future on how to get these important training and updates to your clients.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. So once again, this is a way that RPAG can help your client check that box so that if at some point the DOL does come out and audit the plan, you can say, yes, we are providing fiduciary training. And the other thing I never want to lose sight of is that, what we've done, for example, in this regard is we put together tools to help your clients meet their fiduciary responsibilities. But never lose sight of the fact the end result of all that is that if the client is benchmarking fees, if the client is providing training, if the client is considering ESG factors, the net result of all that is a better retirement outcome for plan participants. And that's the bottom line. That's what we're all about at the end of the day. So I don't want to lose sight of that all this has a purpose, keep your clients out of jail, but also provide a better result for your plan participants. Okay, let's go down now. And so Jesse mentioned Secure Act 2.0. And I just want to close today with talking about the outlook for plan legislation in 2022. Now, generally, I don't like to talk about pending legislation because so much can change in the process. And there's always a question with the divisiveness in Congress, whether any proposed legislation can get through Congress in this day and age. But I do want to keep an eye on Secure 2.0 because this is a bill that has already passed the House and has gone to the Senate. And the reason I want to just call this to everybody's attention is because this bill passed the House with overwhelming support. 415 votes in favor, 5 against. And that type of bipartisan support just doesn't happen today. So I think there's a pretty good chance that we may see legislation this year, probably not before the election in November, but probably sometime between November and the end of the year. Now, here are a few of the key provisions likely to be included in a final bill. The first one, very important if you're in the 403B marketplace. 403B plans would be able to invest in collective investment trusts, which is a very positive development because like in the 401k world, 403B plans will be able to continue to drive investment expense down. Employers will be permitted to make matching contributions to plans on behalf of employees who are repaying student loans. Now, this is also important. Oftentimes with employees who are repaying student loans, as a consequence, they can't afford to save in the 401k plan. As a result, they don't get the company match. Under this proposal, the employers will be able to permit the employee to pay the student loan, count that, and then make a match to the plan based on the student loan repayment. Very positive development. A lot of you may be familiar with this concept from Secure Act 2019. We call it long-term part-time employees. And the idea is if you have a part-time employee who works at least 500 hours during 2 consecutive years, 500 hours works out to about 10 hours a week. So part-time employees after 3 consecutive years will be eligible to participate in the plan. Now, they don't have to get the employer contribution, but they do have to be permitted to make employee salary deferral contributions. This change is already part of Secure Act 2019. It'll be effective in 2024. What the change will be is it'll change it from 3 consecutive years to 2 consecutive years. So long-term part-time employees in after 2 years versus 3. Automatic enrollment will be required for 401k and 403b plans. The initial enrollment will be 3% with auto increase each year by 1% until it reaches 10. So you set up a new 401k plan, a new 403b plan, you have to have auto enrollment. Now, existing plans will be grandfathered. So if you have a current 401 or a current K or a B plan that doesn't have auto enrollment, it can continue not to offer it, but new plans will have to have it. There'll be exceptions if you have a small business and a small business is 10 or fewer employees, or if you have a new business in existence for less than 3 years, those businesses wouldn't have to have auto enrollment right away. There'll be higher catch-up limits for people that are age 62, 63, and 64. The current catch-up limit for age 50 and older is $6,500. It'll be $10,000 for 62, 63, and 64-year-old participants. The MRD will gradually increase from current 72 to 75. You'll be able to do safe harbor correction for automatic enrollment plans. So this would be a plan that has auto enrollment or auto increase. But let's say that you fail to auto enroll those employees. Typically, when you correct that failure to auto enroll, you have to do 2 things. You have to, of course, make up the match the employees would have received. But you also, under certain circumstances, have to make what's called a QNEC, a qualified non-elective contribution equal to up to 50% of the deferral the employee would have made. But there's a safe harbor correction now for plans with auto enrollment, auto increase, if you correct the penalty before 9.5 months after the end of the plan year. So the example would be, let's say that I failed to auto enroll people back in April of 2021. I have until October 15th, 2022 to correct that. I have to make up the match, but I don't have to do a QNEC. Another real important change for professional service groups, closely held businesses, oftentimes those plans are what we call top-heavy plans. Remember, a top-heavy plan means that 60% or more of the money belongs to key employees. When you're designing plans for professional service groups, oftentimes if the plan is not top-heavy, you've done something wrong. Now, this brings into context this idea of dual eligibility. where you might tell your client, might tell their employees, when you come to work for us, you can start putting your own money into the plan right away, immediate eligibility for 401k. But maybe you have to complete some period of service to be eligible for the company contribution. Well, with top-heavy plans, you really can't do that, because if you let people in right away to make 401k deferrals and your plan is top-heavy, the employer has to immediately make the 3% top-heavy contribution for those folks. So dual eligibility doesn't really work for top-heavy plans. But under the proposed legislation, you'll be able to separately apply the top-heavy test, so you can actually have dual eligibility now in top-heavy plans. That's a good change. Once again, mostly I think in the context with doctors, lawyers, accountants, people like that have professional service group plans. Now, how is Congress going to pay for this? Because remember, in this day and age, the idea is if we give you a tax break, we have to find a way to pay for it. So what are the revenue provisions that would be associated with these positive changes? Well, one of the first revenue changes involves simple IRAs. A simple IRA will be allowed now to accept Roth contributions. Right now, those go in on a pre-tax basis, so deductible today. Of course, with Roth, you pay the tax today, you don't pay tax when you take the money out. So what this provision does is it shifts the tax liability from the future to today. That's one way they'll pay for this. Also, employers may permit employees to treat SEP contributions as Roth. Now, with a SEP contribution, the employer makes the contribution, but now employees will be able to elect Roth treatment for that. So once again, accelerate the tax. All catch-up contributions will be subject to Roth tax treatment. So, right now, if I make a catch-up contribution, I can decide whether to make that Roth or pre-tax, just like my 401k. Going forward, all catch-up contributions will have to be Roth. And then also, participants will have the option of receiving employer matching contributions on a Roth basis as well. So the idea is we're not necessarily increasing taxes, we're just speeding up when the tax gets paid to today versus in the future. Okay. That concludes pretty much my presentation. Jesse, do you have a few closing comments?
Sure. Just in terms of Secure 2.0, obviously continue to look out for the alerts and presentations and information that John, Tom, Joel, and the rest of the ERISA team are putting together specifically about that and how you can bring that out to your clients. From a solution and technology perspective, I think of the high line in terms of exciting things like CITs and 403B. If that goes through, well, you already have access to the RPAG CIT suite that you can immediately be able to take over there. And I'm sure we'll have guidance on that as well with our partners at Wilmington Trust on that. From an automatic enrollment perspective and how that works, we have the Plan Navigator tool. It's a really fun modeling tool, and you can integrate that with an investment review. Continue to leverage the ERISA team, whether it's just from a support perspective to our email line. We have the Ask RPAG widget within the RPAG tool that goes directly to our team. So any questions that come up or questions that your clients might have about this, we have a resource for you. It's very robust when it comes to our ERISA compliance. And then last but not least, if we go to the next slide, kind of the ending slide here is, hey, as John brought up with fiduciary education, you want to stay up to date on ERISA. There's a lot of wonderful industry resources out there. I encourage you to do that. We'll continue to provide you with resources and education that you can in turn help educate your clients. It's turnkey. Everything we have is going to help you out. And then review your ERISA support resources, whether it's at your home office, through your broker-dealer, RIA, or here through RPAG. There's a lot of wonderful services out there like Retirement Learning Center and others who do a great job. And we want to help in that regards to with RPAG. So, look beyond just those fees and the investments. Obviously, those are very important when it comes to ERISA, but that fiduciary education and governance through the Fiduciary Fitness Program is going to make sure that you're delivering very actionable resources to your clients and staying and differentiating yourself from competitors who might not be as up to date and might not have the resources that you have access to. So thank you very much for attending to today's webinar. This will be posted on the Video Learning Center shortly. We'll stick around for a few more minutes in case anyone has questions through the chat. But thank you again for joining today, and we look forward to seeing you soon. And thank you, John.